The neural dampening field hummed its particular frequency of despair as Davin Torwick entered the flesh market on Kepler Station, his weathered boots echoing against polished floors that had been designed to amplify the footsteps of those who walked upon them. The sound served as a constant reminder to merchandise that potential buyers were always approaching, always evaluating, always deciding their worth based on criteria that reduced sentient beings to mere components in larger machines of profit and suffering. Bioluminescent advertisements crawled across the walls in 17 different languages, each one advertising the same product with clinical precision that would have impressed the galaxy's most advanced medical researchers. Premium sentient stock, neural compatibility guaranteed, emotional conditioning complete, warranty against psychological regression included. The text pulsed in colors specifically chosen to trigger acquisition responses in different species' visual cortexes, while subliminal frequencies buried in the displays encouraged impulsive decision-making among potential buyers who might otherwise hesitate at the moral implications of their transactions. The air itself carried the metallic taste of suppression chemicals, a carefully balanced cocktail of neuroinhibitors designed to keep merchandise docile while potential buyers evaluated their investments. The atmospheric processes maintained different environmental zones throughout the facility, sulfur-rich pockets for Karathi buyers whose respiratory systems required higher acidity levels, low oxygen sections that kept Vorthak alert and aggressive, high humidity areas that made Rilani neural tissue more conductive and therefore more valuable for direct interface applications. Kepler Station existed in the gravitational shadow of 3 dying stars, positioned perfectly in the jurisdictional void where the hegemony, the corporate syndicate, and the Free Traders Alliance all claimed authority, but none wanted responsibility for what actually occurred within its rotating sections. This deliberate ambiguity had made it the galaxy's premier marketplace for commodities that civilized worlds preferred not to acknowledge existed, while providing legal cover for transactions that would have resulted in immediate military intervention if conducted within any properly governed system. The station's rotating sections generated artificial gravity through centrifugal force, but the effect was deliberately uneven, creating pockets where lighter beings could float in apparent freedom, while heavier species experienced crushing pressure that reminded everyone exactly how little mercy existed in this particular corner of space. The architecture itself had been designed by specialists in psychological manipulation, with sightlines that ensured merchandise could always see potential buyers, while buyers could observe both their intended purchases and their competition for those purchases. Davin moved through the crowd with the careful, measured steps of someone whose body had been broken and imperfectly healed by medical systems that prioritized function over comfort. His left shoulder hung lower than his right, suggesting nerve damage from some long-ago conflict with energy weapons that had left permanent scarring in both flesh and bone. His gait favored his right leg in a way that spoke of extensive reconstructive surgery, performed under battlefield conditions, where survival mattered more than restoring full mobility. His face bore the kind of scars that told stories to those who knew how to read them, the pale, twisted flesh that marked someone who had survived close-range plasma burns, the slight asymmetry around his left eye that suggested shrapnel damage that had nearly cost him his vision, the careful way he held his mouth that indicated dental reconstruction following severe facial trauma. When other patrons looked at him, they saw exactly what he wanted them to see: another broken human, probably a war veteran, scraping together enough credits to buy his way into the galaxy's darker markets, where damaged goods could find purposes that legitimate society would never provide. The main auction chamber stretched 3 stories high, its transparent aluminum walls offering a clear view of the holding pens where today's inventory waited to be processed, according to protocols that had been refined over decades of experimentation with different species' psychological vulnerabilities. The architecture was deliberately imposing, designed to make those being sold feel small and insignificant, while giving buyers a sense of power and control over beings whose fates depended entirely on the outcome of financial negotiations. Atmospheric processors maintained precise environmental controls that served dual purposes, ensuring the health of valuable merchandise while demonstrating to potential buyers that their investments would be protected by sophisticated life support systems. The sulfur-rich air preferred by Karathi, the low-oxygen mixture that kept Vorthak alert and aggressive, the high humidity environment that made Rilani neural tissue more conductive. Each zone represented careful calculation of how to maximize both merchandise value and buyer comfort. In the center of it all, the auction platform rose like an altar to commerce, surrounded by tiered seating that allowed buyers to observe both the merchandise and each other with equal clarity. The social dynamics were as carefully orchestrated as the physical space. Predators needed to see their competition, to understand who else was hunting in their territory, to establish dominance hierarchies that would influence bidding patterns and determine which buyers would ultimately prevail in contests over particularly valuable items. Davin selected a seat in the back corner, where shadows provided visual cover and multiple exit routes remained accessible in case circumstances required rapid departure. From this position, he could observe the entire chamber while appearing to be just another marginal participant, hoping for bargains that wealthier buyers might overlook. His damaged left hand rested on his knee in a carefully calculated position that concealed the military-grade neural interface hidden beneath apparently arthritic knuckles, while his enhanced vision systems recorded everything that occurred within his field of view. The crowd represented the galaxy's predatory elite, beings who had built fortunes through the systematic exploitation of those too weak or too unfortunate to protect themselves from commodification. Vorthak flesh traders dominated one section of the chamber, their forearms ending in specialized appendages designed for evaluating merchandise through direct neural contact that could assess everything from pain tolerance to psychological resilience without leaving visible marks that might reduce market value. Corporate acquisition specialists from the syndicate worlds occupied the premium seating areas, their faces hidden behind privacy screens that projected false features while recording everything they observed for later analysis by organizational psychologists who specialized in identifying valuable traits in sentient beings. These representatives had access to virtually unlimited resources, but they preferred to operate through intermediaries who could maintain the legal fiction that major corporations had no direct involvement in slave trading. Free trader captains scattered throughout the chamber represented the galaxy's most mobile criminal networks, their weather-beaten faces showing the kind of moral flexibility that came from decades of profitable compromises with their own consciences. Their ships carried cargo that never appeared on official manifests, transported beings who had been declared legally dead in their home systems, and operated in the vast spaces between worlds where standard law enforcement had no jurisdiction or authority. Near the front of the chamber, one figure commanded attention through sheer presence rather than obvious display of wealth or status. Vane Vex Moran occupied a priority seating pod that had been customized for his specific physiology, accommodating the elongated skull structure that marked him as a void seeker, providing optimal positioning for the ritual scarification that covered his face and neck, and incorporating the subtle weapons detection systems that he required for personal security in environments where violence was always a possibility. His reputation preceded him through every shadow market in the galaxy, like a virus that infected conversations and influenced decisions long before his actual arrival. Vex Moran was known as a collector of suffering, someone who paid premium prices for merchandise that could survive his particular interests, while providing the kind of prolonged entertainment that satisfied his psychological needs. His presence at any auction automatically escalated both prices and security protocols, as sellers anticipated the kind of bidding war that occurred when someone with unlimited resources and specific tastes encountered exactly what he wanted. The Void Seeker's three eyes moved constantly, scanning the chamber with the predatory awareness of someone who had survived centuries of violence by never allowing potential threats to approach undetected. His scarified features showed no emotion, but those familiar with his species could read the subtle signs that indicated heightened interest: the slight dilation of his primary pupils, the almost imperceptible shift in his breathing pattern, the way his hands remained perfectly still while his attention focused completely on whatever had captured his notice. "Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished entities," the auctioneer announced through translation matrices that converted her words into appropriate frequencies for each species present. She was Korathi, her cybernetically enhanced vocal cords capable of generating the harmonics necessary to influence biopsychology across multiple physiological types. The implants that replaced her natural voice box had cost more than most beings earned in their lifetimes, but they allowed her to modulate emotional responses in ways that could increase final sale prices by significant percentages. Today's premier offering includes neural-compatible juveniles from 7 different worlds, each specimen fully conditioned and verified for immediate integration into your operations. Her voice carried undertones specifically calibrated to trigger acquisition reflexes, while suppressing any inconvenient moral considerations that might interfere with profitable decision-making. The first lots consisted of older children, whose value lay primarily in their trained skills rather than their potential for modification or their capacity to serve as raw material for more extensive alterations. A group of Taraxian adolescents who had been conditioned as personal servants appeared first, their empathic abilities suppressed through careful chemical treatment that left them capable of understanding their owner's needs without experiencing the emotional distress that might interfere with their service. Their conditioning had been performed by specialists who understood exactly how to break psychological resistance without damaging the cognitive functions that made empathic species valuable in the first place. The process involved systematic exposure to scenarios that overwhelmed their natural emotional responses until their minds created protective barriers that could be selectively activated or suppressed depending on their owner's requirements. Following the Taraxians came a selection of young hegemony citizens whose families had fallen into debt through circumstances that ranged from genuine misfortune to carefully orchestrated financial manipulation designed to produce exactly this outcome. Their education and cultural knowledge made them valuable as translators and cultural liaisons in hostile territories where their understanding of hegemony politics and social structures could provide significant advantages to criminal organizations operating within that government's sphere of influence. Davin watched the bidding with apparent disinterest, but his enhanced neural interface was recording everything that occurred within the chamber. The bidding patterns that revealed each buyer's financial limitations and psychological preferences. The subtle reactions that indicated which types of merchandise different predators found most appealing. The security protocols that protected high-value transactions from interference by law enforcement agencies that occasionally attempted to disrupt major sales. His augmented hearing captured conversations conducted in languages and frequency ranges that baseline humans couldn't detect, while his enhanced vision recorded micro-expressions and involuntary responses that revealed information about each participant's intentions and capabilities. The data flowed through processing systems built into his skeletal structure, creating detailed profiles of everyone present that would be transmitted to analysis networks as soon as he could establish secure communication with off-station resources. Lot 47 through 53, the auctioneer announced, and the chamber's atmosphere shifted as the main attraction was revealed with the kind of dramatic timing that experienced sellers used to maximize emotional impact on potential buyers. 7 Rilani children, their ages ranging from approximately 4 to 8 standard years, according to the documentation that accompanied their sale, were guided onto the display platform by automated shepherding systems that use gentle but irresistible force to position them for optimal viewing by the assembled buyers. Their pale, almost translucent skin showed the neural interface ports that made their species so valuable in the galaxy's most advanced technological applications. Direct biological connections to quantum processing networks that turned young Rilani into living components of computational systems that exceeded anything purely mechanical science had been able to achieve. The interface ports had been installed through surgical procedures that required extraordinary precision, as any damage to the surrounding neural tissue would render the subjects useless for their intended applications. The operations had been performed by specialists who combined advanced medical knowledge with complete moral flexibility, creating connections between organic consciousness and quantum processing systems that allowed unprecedented integration between biological and artificial intelligence. Their large dark eyes reflected the chamber's lighting with an intelligence that the conditioning process had been unable to completely suppress, despite the extensive psychological manipulation that had been designed to break their sense of individual identity and replace it with the kind of malleable compliance that buyers preferred in their acquisitions. The conditioning protocols used on Rilani children were among the most sophisticated in the galaxy, combining pharmaceutical intervention with behavioral modification techniques that had been refined through decades of experimentation. Premium neural architecture, the auctioneer continued, her voice taking on the enthusiastic tone of someone describing particularly fine artwork whose value would only increase with time and proper care. Quantum-compatible synaptic structures, pre-installed interface hardware verified through triple redundancy testing, emotional suppression confirmed through direct neural monitoring during stress simulation exercises. These specimens can be integrated directly into Type 7 computational matrices or adapted for specialized applications requiring biological processing power that exceeds current artificial intelligence capabilities. The technical specification she recited represented years of research into the precise ways that Rilani neural systems could interface with different types of quantum processing equipment. The children's brains had been mapped with precision that exceeded most medical procedures, their cognitive capabilities evaluated through testing that pushed them to their psychological limits while recording every aspect of their mental responses. The opening bid came from a corporate syndicate representative whose privacy screen flickered slightly as he transmitted his offer through encrypted channels that would prevent any direct connection between his identity and the transaction. 50,000 credits for the lot. The amount represented a starting point calculated to attract serious buyers while establishing a baseline that would encourage competitive bidding. The syndicate representative's presence indicated that major corporations were actively seeking Rilani children for integration into computational systems that officially didn't exist, but unofficially powered some of the galaxy's most advanced technological research. 75,000, countered a free trader captain whose scarred hands suggested he'd personally handled more merchandise than most dealers processed in their entire careers. His ship's manifest would show the children as cultural artifacts being transported for academic research, but everyone present understood exactly what kind of research would be conducted once they reached their destination. The free trader's bid indicated that mobile criminal networks had developed their own applications for Rilani neural capabilities, probably involving the kind of portable quantum processing systems that allowed sophisticated operations to be conducted from ships that appeared to be simple cargo haulers. The technology required to maintain living computational components in space presented significant challenges, but the advantages gained from having quantum processing power that couldn't be detected by standard scanning equipment made the investment worthwhile for organizations that operated in hostile territory. Davin studied the children with the same apparent disinterest he'd shown toward previous lots, but his enhanced vision was recording details that standard optical sensors would miss even with significant enhancement. The way the youngest girl's hand sought her brother's, despite the neural conditioning designed to suppress familial bonds through systematic psychological manipulation that should have eliminated such responses. The careful positioning that kept the group together, even as automated systems tried to separate them for individual display, suggesting that some level of cooperative behavior had survived the conditioning process. The subtle signs that their conditioning hadn't achieved the complete emotional suppression that the sellers claimed were particularly significant, as buyers paid premium prices specifically for the guarantee that their acquisitions wouldn't experience psychological distress that might interfere with their performance in computational applications. If the conditioning was incomplete, it represented either deliberate fraud on the part of the sellers or evidence that Rilani psychology was more resilient than generally understood. 100,000, announced Vex Moran, his voice carrying harmonics that made several nearby beings step away unconsciously as their species' instinctive threat detection systems responded to frequencies that indicated proximity to an apex predator. The Void Seeker's bid wasn't just about acquisition. It was a territorial claim that warned other predators they were encroaching on his hunting ground and should reconsider their participation in this particular contest. The corporate syndicate representative immediately withdrew from the bidding, his privacy screen going completely opaque as he redirected his attention toward other lots that wouldn't bring him into direct conflict with someone whose reputation for violence extended across multiple star systems. The syndicate had vast resources, but their corporate structure required them to avoid associations with individuals whose activities might attract unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies that generally ignored slave trading, but drew the line at the kind of systematic torture that Void Seekers practiced. The free trader captain held his position for 2 more bidding rounds before the escalating numbers exceeded his available resources and forced him to acknowledge that his organization couldn't compete with someone who had access to the kind of wealth that Void Seeker operations generated. His withdrawal left the field clear for Vex Moran and a few other specialized collectors whose interests ran toward the kind of prolonged suffering that Rilani children could provide once their neural interfaces were modified for applications that prioritized psychological torment over computational efficiency. 200,000, Vex Moran announced, and the finality in his voice suggested he expected this number to end serious competition from anyone who understood the implications of challenging a Void Seeker for merchandise that had captured his particular interest. Davin raised his hand with the casual gesture of someone placing a minor bid on items that held only marginal interest. 250,000. The chamber went quiet in the way that predators pause when they detect something unexpected in their environment, not necessarily threatening, but sufficiently unusual to warrant careful evaluation before proceeding with normal behavior patterns. Conversations stopped in mid-sentence as attention focused on the broken human in the back corner who had just challenged one of the galaxy's most dangerous entities for merchandise that would require vast resources to maintain and sophisticated facilities to utilize effectively. Vex Moran turned to study the source of this challenge, his three eyes focusing on the damaged human with the kind of attention usually reserved for potential threats that required immediate assessment and possible elimination. The Void Seeker's scarified features showed no obvious emotion, but subtle changes in his posture indicated that his threat evaluation systems had identified something worthy of serious consideration. "Most interesting," the Void Seeker said, his voice carrying across the chamber with perfect clarity despite the acoustic dampening systems designed to prevent conversations from interfering with auction proceedings. "Perhaps the damaged human doesn't understand the nature of this particular establishment or the consequences of interfering with transactions that have attracted my personal attention." The words carried implications that everyone present understood perfectly. Vex Moran was offering the human an opportunity to withdraw his bid before circumstances escalated to the point where violence became inevitable. The Void Seeker's reputation for patience extended only as far as his amusement with whatever had captured his interest, and interference with his acquisitions had historically resulted in outcomes that served as warnings to others who might consider similar challenges. 300,000, Davin replied, without acknowledging the implicit threat or showing any awareness that he had just escalated a situation that could easily result in his extremely unpleasant death. The auctioneer's cybernetic systems were running probability calculations at maximum capacity, trying to understand why a being who appeared to have limited resources was challenging one of the galaxy's most dangerous predators over merchandise that would require substantial infrastructure to utilize effectively. Standard auction protocols required financial verification above certain thresholds, but something in the human's demeanor suggested this wasn't a bluff or a mistake, born of ignorance about either the amounts involved or the nature of his competition. Vex Moran's scarified features arranged themselves into what might have been amusement if it hadn't carried such obvious undertones of violence barely held in check by curiosity about what the human thought he could accomplish. "You fascinate me, broken thing. What possible use could a creature like you have for Rilani processing units that would justify the considerable expense of maintaining them in proper operational condition?" "Maybe I don't like the idea of children being turned into computer components," Davin said quietly, his voice carrying through the chamber's acoustics with surprising clarity for someone who appeared to be speaking casually rather than making a formal statement. The Void Seeker's laugh was like grinding metal, a sound that triggered instinctive fear responses in most carbon-based life forms, while conveying amusement that held no warmth or genuine humor. "How delightfully primitive. Your species still clings to such quaint notions about the sanctity of individual consciousness and the inherent value of biological life. How many of your own kind died learning better during the integration wars, when reality demonstrated the true relationship between sentiment and survival?" 500,000, Davin said instead of answering, his response indicating either complete indifference to the Void Seeker's attempt at psychological manipulation or confidence that philosophical discussions were irrelevant to the current situation. The number sent a ripple of surprise through the chamber as beings throughout the gallery began calculating the implications of what they were witnessing. At this level, they were discussing resources that exceeded most beings' lifetime earnings and approached the kind of wealth that only major corporations or government agencies could access without significant strain on their operational budgets. The other bidders began making discrete calculations about who this human might be and where he had gained access to funds that rivaled corporate treasuries. The possibilities ranged from front operations for major criminal organizations to government agencies conducting covert operations that required maintaining deep cover identities. Either explanation suggested that the apparently broken human represented connections to power structures that operated far beyond the normal commercial frameworks that governed most auction house transactions. Vex Moran studied Davin with renewed interest, his predatory instincts recognizing that what had appeared to be easy prey might present unexpected challenges that would require different approaches than simple intimidation. The Void Seeker's 3 eyes remained fixed on the human as he considered possibilities that ranged from elaborate deception to genuine access to resources that exceeded even his own considerable wealth. "Financial verification required," he announced, invoking auction house protocols that would expose whether the human's resources matched his apparent confidence and force him to demonstrate concrete proof that his bids represented legitimate offers rather than desperate bluffs designed to disrupt legitimate business proceedings. "Of course," Davin agreed without hesitation. He reached into his jacket with the slow, careful movements of someone accustomed to being searched for weapons, and withdrew what appeared to be a standard credit chip, the kind of basic financial storage device that might hold a worker's monthly salary or a small merchant's emergency reserves. The chip's surface was scratched and worn, suggesting it had passed through many hands over considerable time and had been used for numerous transactions in environments where careful handling wasn't always possible. Its appearance reinforced the impression that its owner operated on the margins of legitimate commerce, dealing in cash transactions that left minimal electronic records and could be conducted without attracting attention from financial monitoring systems. When he placed it on the verification scanner, the chamber's main display systems processed the information with the kind of routine efficiency that characterized thousands of similar transactions conducted every day throughout the galaxy's commercial networks. The numbers that appeared on the display caused several beings to make involuntary sounds of disbelief that echoed through the chamber, despite the acoustic dampening designed to prevent such disruptions. 700 million credits, available for immediate transfer through financial networks that had verified the fund's legitimacy and confirmed that no legal restrictions prevented their use in commercial transactions. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pause. This was the kind of quiet that preceded either violence or very careful negotiations between parties who had suddenly discovered that their initial assumptions about each other's capabilities had been completely wrong. Beings throughout the chamber began making discreet calls to their intelligence networks, activating communication protocols that would allow them to gather information about the broken human who had just demonstrated access to resources that could destabilize entire economic sectors if deployed strategically. Corporate representatives were consulting databases that contained financial profiles for every known major player in the galaxy's criminal networks, searching for any reference to human organizations that operated with the kind of resources that had just been displayed. Government intelligence agencies were activating surveillance protocols designed to identify potential threats to established power structures, while criminal organizations were calculating whether the human represented an opportunity for profitable cooperation or a threat that required immediate elimination. "Continue," Davin said simply, his voice carrying the kind of calm confidence that suggested the enormous sum he had just verified represented only a fraction of his total available resources. Vex Moran's casual cruelty had been replaced by genuine curiosity as his assessment of the situation underwent fundamental revision. The Void Seeker's 3 eyes remained fixed on the human as he processed implications that extended far beyond simple commercial competition, considering possibilities that ranged from covert operations by major governments to the emergence of previously unknown power structures that had remained hidden until circumstances forced them to reveal their capabilities. 1 million credits, Vex Moran announced, his voice carrying through the gallery like a weapon being drawn in preparation for combat. 2 million, Davin countered immediately, without pause or hesitation that might suggest he was approaching the limits of his financial resources. The auctioneer systems were struggling to process transactions at this scale, as the amounts involved exceeded the normal parameters that governed commercial exchanges conducted through the station's financial networks. Emergency protocols were activating throughout Kepler Station as automated financial safeguards tried to understand whether they were witnessing legitimate commerce or some form of economic warfare that required immediate intervention by security forces trained to handle threats to the station's commercial operations. Security forces were mobilizing throughout the facility not to stop the auction, but to protect a transaction that now represented more wealth than most worlds generated in standard years, and therefore required the kind of comprehensive protection normally reserved for diplomatic negotiations or major corporate mergers that could affect multiple star systems simultaneously. Most curious, Vex Moran mused, his voice carrying new harmonics that suggested his interest had moved beyond simple predation and into the realm of puzzle solving that required careful analysis of available information. I've made some inquiries during our little contest, Broken Human. It seems no one knows anything about you. No previous transactions recorded in any commercial database, no corporate affiliations listed in any registry, no government connections documented through any intelligence network. You simply appeared. Uji, the Void Seeker's statement carried implications that everyone present understood. Beings with access to the kind of resources Davin had demonstrated didn't remain anonymous by accident, and the absence of any recorded history suggested either extraordinarily sophisticated operational security or connections to organizations that operated completely outside normal commercial and governmental frameworks. Sometimes that's enough, Davin replied, his response providing no additional information while indicating that he felt no obligation to explain himself to anyone present. 5 million, Vex Moran announced, his voice carrying through the gallery like a weapon being drawn in preparation for a confrontation that would determine which of them possessed the greater resources and determination. 10 million, Davin countered immediately, his instantaneous response indicating that he had been prepared for escalation to this level and possessed the resources necessary to continue the contest indefinitely. At this point, the chamber's atmosphere had shifted completely from routine commercial transaction to something resembling a confrontation between major powers whose capabilities extended far beyond anything that should have been possible for individual participants in a slave auction. What had begun as a simple sale of exotic merchandise had become something else entirely. A test of strength between forces that neither the auction house nor most observers fully understood. The Rilani children on the display platform had stopped their quiet sobbing and were staring upward with expressions that suggested they sensed something significant was happening above them, though their conditioning prevented them from fully understanding the implications of the financial contest that was determining their fate. Their pale faces reflected the display screens showing numbers that climbed higher with each exchange, amounts that represented more wealth than their entire homeworld generated in standard centuries. The auctioneer's mechanical voice cut through the tension with announcements that sent cold understanding through everyone present. Credit verification confirmed. Bidder designation damaged human has demonstrated capacity for unlimited financial transactions through networks that extend across 47 different star systems. Unlimited. The implications hit the chamber like a physical force that seemed to press down on everyone present. Unlimited financial resources meant connections to power structures that existed beyond normal commercial or political frameworks, suggesting backing from organizations that operated on scales most beings couldn't comprehend and possessed capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about how the galaxy's power structures actually functioned. Beings throughout the gallery were making urgent communications to intelligence services that spanned multiple governments and criminal organizations, trying to understand whether they were witnessing the emergence of a new power player or the revelation of an existing one that had remained hidden until circumstances forced them to demonstrate their true capabilities. Vex Moran went completely still, a reaction that those familiar with void-seeker behavior recognized as extremely dangerous territory that typically preceded either immediate violence or very careful strategic withdrawal from situations that exceeded even their considerable capabilities. When creatures dedicated to inflicting suffering stopped moving, it usually meant they were calculating the most efficient way to destroy whatever had captured their attention or determining whether survival required abandoning their current objectives entirely. "Withdraw your bid," he said quietly, and the words carried harmonics that could induce fear responses in most carbon-based life forms, while conveying implications about consequences that would extend far beyond simple financial loss. "No," Davin said simply, his refusal delivered with the kind of calm finality that suggested he had considered all possible consequences and remained committed to his current course of action, regardless of what threats might be directed against him. 20 million, Vex Moran announced, his voice carrying a finality that suggested he expected this number to end the contest by demonstrating resources that exceeded what any rational being would commit to acquiring merchandise that, while valuable, could be replaced through other transactions with less risk and expense. 50 million. Davin replied without even blinking, his instantaneous response indicating that amounts which would bankrupt most organizations represented mere fractions of his available resources. The gallery erupted in controlled chaos as beings from 17 different worlds began making urgent communications to their respective intelligence services, activating emergency protocols designed to handle situations where established power balances might be shifting in ways that could affect the stability of entire star systems. Corporate networks throughout the galaxy were mobilizing resources to trace the source of funds that could destabilize entire economic sectors if deployed with strategic intent. Government agencies were scrambling to understand whether they were witnessing the emergence of a new threat to established order or the revelation of existing capabilities that had remained hidden until circumstances forced their exposure. The implications extended far beyond simple commercial competition. They were potentially witnessing evidence of power structures that operated completely outside known frameworks and possessed resources that could challenge the authority of major governments. And somewhere in the background, careful observers might have noticed that certain systems on Kepler Station were responding to commands that weren't being transmitted through standard channels, suggesting that the apparently spontaneous bidding war might be occurring within a framework of preparation and control that extended far beyond what most participants realized. "You begin to interest me beyond simple commercial considerations," Vex Moran said, rising from his seat with fluid grace that spoke of enhanced reflexes and weapon systems built directly into his skeletal structure. "Perhaps we should discuss this matter in a more private setting, where we can explore the full implications of your apparent capabilities." The suggestion carried implications that everyone present understood. Vex Moran was proposing to resolve their competition through methods that would determine not just who acquired the merchandise, but who possessed the greater capacity for violence and the willingness to employ it in pursuit of their objectives. "The auction continues," Davin said firmly, his refusal to engage in private negotiations indicating either complete confidence in his ability to handle whatever threats the Void Seeker might deploy, or certainty that the current public setting provided protections that would be lost in any private confrontation. 100 million, Vex Moran announced, his voice carrying throughout the chamber with the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance, and suggested that further challenges would result in consequences that extended far beyond financial competition. 500 million, Davin replied, his response delivered with the same calm confidence he had maintained throughout the entire contest. The number seemed to hang in the air like something physical, a weight that pressed down on everyone present and forced them to contemplate implications that challenged their understanding of how economic power actually functioned in the galaxy. At this level, they were discussing resources that could purchase entire star systems, fund decades of military campaigns, or reshape the economic structure of multiple worlds simultaneously. The auctioneer's systems actually stuttered at this point, struggling to process a transaction that exceeded the station's annual GDP by several orders of magnitude and approached the kind of wealth that only the largest governments or corporate entities could access without creating significant strain on their operational capabilities. Emergency protocols were cascading through Kepler station's networks as automated systems tried to understand whether they were witnessing legitimate commerce or some form of economic warfare that required immediate military intervention. Throughout the chamber, beings were making calculations that extended far beyond simple curiosity about the identity of the mysterious human. If someone with unlimited resources was willing to spend enormous sums to protect alien children from being sold into slavery, what other interventions might they be prepared to undertake? What other operations might they be conducting throughout the galaxy? What other assumptions about human capabilities might be completely wrong? In the holding pen below, the Rilani children had stopped responding to the automated shepherding systems and were staring upward at the gallery with expressions that suggested they understood on some level that their fate was being decided by forces beyond their comprehension. Their pale faces reflected the display screens, showing numbers that climbed higher with each exchange, amounts that represented more wealth than their entire civilization had ever possessed. But something else was happening in their expressions, a growing sense of recognition that seemed impossible given their documented background and the conditioning they had undergone. They were looking at the broken human in the back corner with the kind of attention that suggested familiarity rather than simple curiosity about the being who was bidding for their ownership. "Fascinating," Vexmoran murmured, tilting his elongated head in a gesture that reminded observers of a predator reassessing what it had initially dismissed as harmless prey. "You present several interesting possibilities, broken human. Either you represent resources that extend far beyond anything my intelligence networks have identified, or you're engaged in some form of elaborate deception that will culminate in your extremely painful death when your limitations are finally exposed." 1 billion credits, Davin said quietly, his words falling into the chamber like stones dropped into still water. The announcement created ripples of consequence that spread outward through communication networks spanning the galaxy as beings throughout the chamber struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. At this level of financial commitment, they were no longer discussing simple commercial transactions. They were witnessing the emergence of power that operated on scales usually reserved for major governments or the largest corporate entities. And then something happened that changed everything about how everyone present understood what they were witnessing. Davin stood up. It was a simple motion, the kind of thing any being might do during a lengthy auction when shifting position became necessary for comfort. But as he rose from his seat, his carefully maintained posture of damage and defeat fell away like a discarded costume that had served its purpose and was no longer needed to maintain the illusion he had been projecting. His left shoulder, which had appeared to hang uselessly throughout the entire auction, moved with perfect coordination that suggested his apparent disability had been an elaborate performance rather than genuine physical limitation. His scarred face revealed expressions of intelligence and calculation that had been hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed vulnerability, while his movements displayed the kind of fluid precision that spoke of extensive physical conditioning rather than the chronic pain he had been simulating. The transformation was subtle but complete, visible to anyone who understood how to read body language and recognize the difference between genuine limitation and sophisticated deception. Where observers had seen a broken human scraping together enough resources for a desperate bid, they now witnessed something else entirely, a being who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to power, who spoke with the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed, and who displayed capabilities that challenged every assumption they had made about his true nature. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent gallery with tones that conveyed authority rather than desperation, "let's make this interesting." He reached into his jacket and withdrew not one credit chip, but 7. Each one was identical to the first, scratched, worn, unremarkable in appearance, but containing resources that exceeded most beings' capacity to comprehend. As they landed on the scanner platform with soft sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the silence that had fallen over the auction house, the true scope of what they were witnessing began to emerge. The verification systems processed each chip in sequence, their displays showing numbers that climbed steadily higher until the accumulated total exceeded the computational capacity of the auction house's financial networks. When the final calculation appeared on the main display, it showed a simple message that conveyed implications far beyond its apparent simplicity. Resources exceed calculation parameters. "Everything I have," Davin announced calmly, his voice carrying through the chamber with the kind of quiet authority that made silence mandatory. "Final bid." Vex Moran stared at the display, then at Davin, then back at the display as his threat assessment systems struggled to process information that challenged every assumption he had made about the nature of their confrontation. For the first time in centuries, the Void Seeker experienced something approaching uncertainty as he contemplated possibilities that extended far beyond simple commercial competition. The harmonics in his voice had shifted from predatory confidence to genuine confusion as he asked, "What are you?" "Someone who doesn't like seeing children sold to monsters," Davin replied. Then he smiled, and it was the kind of expression that suggested predators could become prey very quickly under the right circumstances. The expression transformed his scarred features from broken vulnerability into something that radiated quiet menace, the kind of controlled danger that spoke of capabilities held in reserve and violence that could be deployed with surgical precision when circumstances required it. The auctioneer, its mechanical systems struggling to process what they were witnessing while maintaining the commercial protocols that governed all transactions, managed to announce through voice synthesizers that had begun generating harmonic distortions. Lot 47 through 53, sold to bidder designation. Davin Torwick, he supplied helpfully, his tone suggesting that providing his real name represented either complete confidence in his ability to handle whatever consequences might follow, or certainty that concealment was no longer necessary for whatever operation he was conducting. "Human Earth origin," he paused, seeming to consider his words carefully before adding with deliberate emphasis, "retired." The word "retired" carried implications that everyone present understood, but none wanted to articulate directly. Beings who possessed unlimited financial resources and spoke with quiet authority about protecting alien children from predators didn't retire from normal occupations. They retired from activities that required exactly the kind of capabilities Davin had been demonstrating throughout the auction. As the implications of what had just happened began spreading through the gallery like a virus transmitted through electronic communication networks, certain beings started making urgent calls to their respective intelligence services, while others activated emergency protocols designed to handle situations where established assumptions about power structures had been fundamentally challenged. A human with unlimited financial resources had just outbid one of the galaxy's most dangerous entities to purchase a group of alien children, displaying capabilities that suggested Earth's species might not be quite as primitive or powerless as generally assumed by those who made policy decisions affecting human populations throughout the galaxy. But that was only the beginning of revelations that would challenge everything the assembled predators thought they understood about the nature of the game they had been playing. The real shock came when Davin walked down to the holding pen to collect his property, moving with fluid grace that bore no resemblance to the damaged gait he had displayed while taking his seat. His steps were measured and precise, covering the distance between the gallery and the merchandise display area with the kind of efficiency that suggested extensive training in movement techniques designed to minimize exposure while maximizing tactical advantage. When he reached the containment field that separated the Rilani children from the rest of the auction house, something impossible happened. The children, who had never seen a human before according to all available records, who had undergone conditioning designed to suppress their ability to form emotional attachments, who should have responded to any potential purchaser with the same terrified compliance they had shown throughout the auction, immediately ran to him with expressions of relief and recognition, as if they had been waiting for exactly this moment, as if this had all been planned. The youngest girl reached the containment field first, pressing her pale hands against the energy barrier while speaking rapidly in the musical tones of the Rilani language. Her words carried emotional undertones that should have been impossible, given the psychological conditioning documented in her sale records, while her expression showed the kind of desperate hope that suggested she recognized not just a potential rescuer, but someone specific she had been expecting to appear. Vex Moran watched from the gallery as the human knelt down to speak quietly with the Rilani children, his three eyes recording details that his threat assessment systems were struggling to process within any framework that made sense according to established information about human capabilities and limitations. The conversation between Davin and the children was being conducted in their native language, a language that hadn't been taught to humans ever under any circumstances. The Rilani had maintained strict cultural isolation until their recent conquest, and their linguistic patterns incorporated harmonic elements that human vocal cords shouldn't be capable of producing without extensive surgical modification. Yet Davin was speaking with them as fluently as if he had grown up among their people, using tonal variations that conveyed not just meaning, but emotional nuance that suggested deep familiarity with their cultural context. The children responded to him with the kind of trust that transcended mere hope. They were interacting with him as if they had been expecting exactly this person to arrive at exactly this moment, to fulfill promises that someone had made to them under circumstances that weren't documented in any official records. "Most fascinating," the Void Seeker murmured, beginning to understand that he had witnessed something far more significant than a simple auction disrupted by an eccentric human with unusual financial resources. How very educational. His words carried new harmonics that suggested his interest had moved beyond simple puzzle solving into the realm of genuine concern about implications that could affect his own long-term survival. Beings who operated at Vex Moran's level of the galaxy's criminal hierarchy didn't achieve their positions without developing highly sophisticated threat detection capabilities, and everything he was observing suggested that fundamental assumptions about human capabilities had been dangerously incorrect. Davin looked up at him from across the chamber and smiled again, the expression conveying messages that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it was the acknowledgement of one professional recognizing another's capabilities. Beneath that, it was a warning that suggested the Void Seeker should reconsider any plans he might be developing for future interactions. At the deepest level, it was a statement of fact. The game they had all been playing was about to change in ways none of them had anticipated. "See you around, Vex Moran," he said, his words carrying implications about future encounters that could be interpreted as either promise or threat, depending on the listener's perspective and future behavior. The containment field deactivated with a soft harmonic that signaled the completion of the transaction, and the children followed Davin out of the auction house without looking back. Their small hands held onto his coat as if they had been waiting their entire lives for this moment, while their expressions showed the kind of relief that suggested they had never doubted that rescue would eventually come. As they disappeared into the corridors of Kepler Station, observers throughout the galaxy began asking a very important question that would drive intelligence-gathering operations for decades to come. If this broken human could access unlimited resources, speak languages he shouldn't know, and navigate the galaxy's most dangerous black markets with perfect confidence, what else could humans do that nobody had noticed? The answer, as several intelligence services were about to discover through investigations that would reveal the scope of their oversight, was far more than anyone had imagined. Station security footage would later show Davin and the children boarding a transport that wasn't listed in any official registry, departing through docking bay configurations that hadn't existed according to the station's architectural records until moments before their arrival. The ship itself appeared to be of human design, but incorporated technologies that shouldn't exist according to Earth's known scientific capabilities. Quantum displacement systems that could bypass normal space-time limitations, neural shielding that blocked even military-grade scanning equipment, and power sources that generated more energy than most space stations required for full operational capacity. The vessel's departure trajectory led toward coordinates that showed empty space according to all available charts, but long-range sensors detected gravitational anomalies that suggested the presence of structures too large to be hidden by conventional stealth technology. Whatever destination Davin was heading toward existed outside the mapped regions of the galaxy, in areas where human presence had never been officially documented or acknowledged by any government or commercial organization. More disturbing for those who attempted to investigate the financial aspects of what they had witnessed, when various intelligence agencies tried to trace the credit transfers that had funded Davin's bidding, they discovered that the money had come from accounts scattered across 47 different worlds, some of which had been opened decades before humans had supposedly made first contact with those civilizations. The implications were staggering and challenged fundamental assumptions about the timeline of human expansion into galactic civilization. Either humans had been conducting covert operations throughout the galaxy for far longer than anyone realized, or they possessed capabilities that allowed them to establish financial networks across interstellar distances without detection by any of the major intelligence services that monitored such activities as part of their basic operational security. Corporate intelligence networks that prided themselves on tracking every significant financial movement in their territories found themselves confronting evidence that major resource transfers had been occurring under their surveillance for decades without triggering any of the automated monitoring systems designed to detect exactly such activities. The sophistication required to maintain such operational security suggested access to technologies and methodologies that exceeded anything in their databases. Government security agencies discovered that their threat assessment protocols had been systematically failing to identify what appeared to be a major intelligence operation that had been developing within their jurisdictions for unknown periods of time. The possibility that human organizations had been operating at such levels of sophistication while maintaining perfect concealment represented a fundamental failure of basic security assumptions that had guided policy for generations. 3 days later, Vex Moran would find himself in an almost identical situation at a flesh market in the Tau Ceti system, bidding against another broken human whose presentation and capabilities matched Davin's performance in ways that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. This one, a female who gave her name as Elena Vasquez and claimed to be a former mining engineer whose family had been killed in industrial accidents, would display similar resources, similar capabilities, and a similar interest in protecting alien children from exactly the kind of fate the Void Seeker preferred to inflict. Her background story would prove as untraceable as Davon's had been, while her financial resources would demonstrate the same apparently unlimited nature that suggested connections to organizations that operated completely outside normal commercial or governmental frameworks. The pattern would repeat itself across the galaxy with disturbing regularity that indicated systematic planning rather than spontaneous humanitarian intervention. Damaged humans appearing at slave markets, refugee camps, and other locations where the vulnerable gathered, always with resources that exceeded reasonable expectations, always with knowledge that suggested preparation rather than coincidence, always with capabilities that challenged assumptions about what Earth species could accomplish when properly motivated and organized. Within a week of the incident on Kepler Station, reports would begin filtering in from across the galaxy about humans appearing in places they shouldn't be, with resources they shouldn't have, displaying knowledge and capabilities that suggested Earth's species had been playing a much longer game than anyone had realized. The integration wars, everyone had assumed, had broken humanity's spirit and left them as a minor species scrambling to find their place in a galaxy controlled by their superiors. The official records showed human casualties in the billions, infrastructure destroyed across multiple worlds, technological capabilities reduced to pre-industrial levels on most Earth colonies, and political structures that had been systematically dismantled to prevent any organized resistance to alien authority. But what if those records had been deliberately falsified? What if the apparent destruction had been carefully orchestrated theater designed to convince the galaxy's predatory species that humanity posed no threat to their established operations? What if the integration wars had never been about conquest, but about positioning human assets exactly where they needed to be for operations that would unfold over decades? What if the humans had never been broken? What if they had been exactly where they needed to be, doing exactly what they needed to do, waiting for the moment when the galaxy's predators would finally reveal themselves completely through their participation in markets that traded in the suffering of innocence? In a secure facility orbiting Jupiter, hidden within the gravitational shadow of the gas giant, where it couldn't be detected by conventional scanning techniques, data from thousands of similar operations was being compiled and analyzed by beings who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing helpless while gathering intelligence on every predatory species in the galaxy. The facility itself represented technologies that officially didn't exist, constructed using materials and techniques that human science was supposedly decades away from developing. Its personnel included individuals whose official records showed them as casualties of various conflicts, refugees who had disappeared into the galaxy's vast populations, and ordinary citizens who had been declared legally dead following accidents that had been carefully staged to provide them with new identities. The Rilani children Davon had rescued were being integrated into communities of other species youth who had been removed from various black markets over the past several decades, all of them rescued by humans whose documented backgrounds showed them as damaged individuals operating on the margins of galactic society. The rescue operations had been coordinated across multiple star systems, timed to create maximum psychological impact on the predators who had been systematically identified and catalogued through years of careful observation. Their rescuers all shared certain characteristics that had been deliberately cultivated to create the impression of vulnerability while concealing capabilities that would have terrified the galaxy's criminal networks if they had been properly understood. Apparent damage that concealed perfect health, limited resources that masked access to unlimited funding, and a tendency to appear in exactly the right places at exactly the right times to intercept operations that preyed upon the innocent. The facility's director, Admiral Keiko Nakamura, reviewed the latest reports with satisfaction that had been decades in the making. her scarred features showing the kind of expression that came from watching carefully laid plans finally reaching their intended culmination. The scars on her face were real, souvenirs from the integration wars that had cost her family, her homeworld, and everything she had cared about, except the burning desire to ensure that such losses would be avenged in ways that the perpetrators would never see coming. Phase 1 of the operation was proceeding ahead of schedule, with better results than the most optimistic projections had suggested possible. The galaxy's criminal networks had been thoroughly infiltrated at every level, their key players identified through direct observation, their operational methods completely mapped through participation in their activities, and their financial structures documented with precision that would allow coordinated action across multiple star systems simultaneously. More importantly, species throughout the galaxy were beginning to understand that humans were far more dangerous than they had ever imagined, a realization that would influence their future behavior in ways that would make the next phases of the operation significantly easier to implement. The broken man who had outbid a monster to save 7 children was just one piece of a puzzle that stretched across the galaxy, involving thousands of operatives who had spent decades establishing themselves in positions where they could protect the innocent while identifying those who preyed upon them. Each rescue operation served multiple purposes, saving lives that would otherwise be lost to systematic exploitation, gathering intelligence about the networks that facilitated such exploitation, and demonstrating to the galaxy's predators that their activities were being monitored by forces they had consistently underestimated. The psychological impact of these revelations was already cascading through communication networks, as criminal organizations began questioning fundamental assumptions about human capabilities and intentions. If humans could operate at such levels of sophistication while maintaining perfect concealment, what other operations might they be conducting? What other activities might they be monitoring? What other assumptions about the balance of power in the galaxy might be dangerously incorrect? And now that Phase 1 was complete, Phase 2 could begin. The real war wasn't going to be fought with fleets and armies that could be detected and countered through conventional military responses. It was going to be fought with information that had been gathering for decades, resources that had been systematically accumulated through careful financial planning, and the kind of strategic patience that only humans seemed capable of maintaining across generations, while their enemies convinced themselves that their victims posed no threat. The galaxy's predators had spent decades perfecting their methods, refining their techniques for identifying and exploiting the vulnerable, while avoiding the attention of authorities who might interfere with their profitable operations. They had developed sophisticated networks for transportation, communication, and financial transactions that allowed them to operate across multiple star systems while maintaining the legal fiction that their activities were legitimate commercial enterprises. But every network they had created, every method they had developed, every technique they had refined had been observed, documented, and understood by human operatives who had spent years earning their trust while gathering the information that would eventually be used to destroy them completely. The criminals who bought and sold sentient beings as commodities had never considered the possibility that their victims might have allies who possessed the patience to spend decades gathering the evidence necessary to ensure that justice, when it finally came, would be both comprehensive and permanent. They were about to learn exactly how dangerous it was to underestimate humanity's capacity for strategic